All right, good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here just a little after 6 o'clock. Thank you for coming. This is the, fourth installation in the Great Depression Lecture Series. So, as someone mentioned last week, we're into the meat and potatoes of it, so we're into the Depression. So, today we'll talk a little bit about FDR and his kind of first presidential administration from 32 to 36, and then we'll meet again next month. So, go to the next slide. So where we'll start, and what's most interesting, is that the central figure of our next couple lectures is going to be FDR, right? He's you can't talk about the Depression without talking about FDR, right? 4 terms, ends in 1944. And so where we'll start today is with his inaugural address, and then we'll talk a little bit about FDR as a person and how this kind of shapes out. So on March 4th, right, before they do the inauguration in January, FDR delivers his inaugural address. The newly elected president told the nation, and I'll quote from his inaugural here. This might sound familiar to many of you, right? And so he says, "So first of all," this is his concluding thoughts, "let me assure my firm belief that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." And so this is the spirit of FDR when he takes over the administration. The failed administration of Herbert Hoover, as we talked about last week, and the subsequent failed administrations of the Republican ascendancy. But next slide. We'll talk a little bit about who FDR was. How did this middle-aged politician from New York State become the longest reigning president in American history? So FDR is born in Hyde Park, New York, to wealthy parents in 1886. They're from money. So the Roosevelts were old money. They were the aristocracy, right? On his maternal side, Delano, where he gets his his middle name was his mother's maiden. Her family had made money in the opium trade. They were legally smuggling opium in the 19th century out of China. On his dad's side, the Roosevelts had been in New York State since the 1600s, had held financial holdings as well as land and property. And so FDR is born really into one of the wealthiest families in America. They're unburdened by that industrial wealth that comes out of the 1920s. He's not like Ford. He's not like J.P. Morgan. He's not like Carnegie and Vanderbilt. He's not a self-made man, right? He inherits millions and millions of dollars. In 1909, he gets married to his 5th cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, once removed, the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States. During the First World War, his connections in New York State politics allows Woodrow Wilson to appoint him to the undersecretary position of the Navy, a position that was once held by Teddy Roosevelt himself. And he uses that post to kind of leverage his political career afterwards. In 1921, he contracts polio on a vacation to Canada that's going to leave the president paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Next slide. But polio and his subsequent paralysis is not going to stop FDR from becoming a monumental force in American politics. In fact, he's going to use that to kind of leverage his own strength and kind of vitality. And so in 1928, at behest of Al Smith, the Democratic nominee for president of that same year, the former governor of New York, who encourages him to run for governor, which he does. New York at this time in 1928 is a Republican-controlled state. But FDR has popularity. He's got name recognition, being related to Teddy Roosevelt. He stood in his time in the state senate in opposition to Tammany Hall, a political machine out of New York State that handpicked candidates. And he also has a very robust progressive record in the state senate. And despite his paralysis, he's going to actually tour the state of New York pretty prodigiously. He's going to do it as he does when he's president, in cars and trains. And when he gives speeches, he's going to hold onto the podium very strong like this. No one knows that FDR cannot walk without the assistance of leg braces or without a wheelchair, a fact that will remain through much of his presidency. In 1928, he does win the gubernatorial election in New York by a slim margin of 25,000 votes, and despite Herbert Hoover carrying the state of New York in the 1928 presidential elections. FDR, when he takes over, the governor is going to face opposition as the House and Senate in New York are still controlled by Republicans. And this is where he's going to really hedge his expertise as a political navigator in jumping off of the governorship into the presidency. And so in his 2 terms, he serves from 1929 to 1932. He is going to be the foremost governor to tackle the Depression head on. One of his first kind of moves is that he's going to create a state-based relief program for the unemployed. He's going to add old age pension insurance to the elderly. He's going to increase public development on the St. Lawrence Riverway to make more energy and electricity for New Yorkers. He's going to, importantly, champion tax relief for farmers and the elimination or reduction in property taxes for those practicing agriculture. He's going to launch reforestation programs and reductions in forest or improvements to forest management. And he's really going to lay the groundwork for what becomes the New Deal as governor of New York. Next slide. And because of his success in New York, a Republican-controlled state, tackling the Depression head-on, following 1929 into the early 1930s, when the country, as we talked about last week, gets grappled with the Great Depression, he's going to use that momentum to spring himself into the election of 1932 for the President of the United States. There's going to be a memorable figure from last week, Herbert Hoover, the incumbent Republican president who is going to run for re-election in 1932. And before we talk about FDR's plan for this New Deal, not yet kind of told to the American public, it's important that we first talk about what Herbert Hoover is offering the American public in 32. But it's important to remember what the conditions of America were like between 29 and 32 under Hoover's presidency. Unemployment had jumped to 22%. The GDP had dropped by 23% between 1931 and 1932 alone. The Dow Jones dropped from 241 points to 60 points. And there were almost 6,000 bank failures in town and country across the United States. That's on top of life savings of thousands of Americans being wiped out virtually overnight, on top of farm and home foreclosures across the United States, right? Herbert Hoover, if I'm in his position, doesn't have much to stand on, I would argue. But he is going to run on this very beautiful campaign of stay the course. What is the course? The course, as FDR will argue, is more destruction. He's going to argue that Republican policies are actually shaping the fight against the Great Depression. Just give me 4 more years and you'll see at the end that we're actually doing something, right? He says that we're at a crossroads in the ideals of the nation, and that we're going to turn the tide, that if FDR wins, it's going to be a big interventionist government. Stay with the Republicans, limited government, it's working. He's also going to oppose FDR's New Deal, as he describes it, because it's a dangerous expansion in government power that's going to limit the individual liberties of Americans. Next slide. FDR, if you were going to put it simply, calls hooey. And in the Democratic National Convention in 1932, he's going to challenge Hoover's notions of American progress and how the government is supposed to react to the Great Depression. And I'll quote from his acceptance speech at the DNC in 1932. It's rather lengthy, but I think it summarizes what Roosevelt is arguing. He says, and I quote, "Never before in modern history have the essential differences between the two major American parties stood out in such striking contrast as they do today." Hindsight's 2020, we all get along in 2020s, right? Republican leaders not only have failed in material things, they have failed in national vision, because in disaster they have held out no hope. They have pointed out no path for the people below to climb back to places of security and safety in American life. He says, on farms, in the large metropolitan areas, in the smaller cities, and in the villages, millions of our citizens cherish the hope that their old standards of living and of thought have not gone forever. Those millions cannot and shall not hope in vain. And he concluded by telling the delegates of the DNC this very important phrase that lived on for the rest of his administration. "I pledge to you, and I pledge to myself, to a new deal for the American people. Let us all here assembled constitute ourselves prophets of a new order of competence and of courage. This is not a political campaign, it is a call to arms. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own." Next slide. And as you can see from the map, Americans agree overwhelmingly with the vision that FDR is promising them in 1932. FDR wins a landslide victory in the election of 1932, one of the largest in modern history until Ronald Reagan's 1984 victory against Walter Mondale. He wins 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. And it leads to the formation of a new coalition in American politics, one that's going to dominate until the 1960s, or the New Deal coalition, right? Historians now, and myself included, call this a coalition of contradictions, and I'll explain why. He unites Americans, and if you look at the map, it's mostly blue, through labor unions are going to support FDR. Workers and farmers are going to support FDR. Urban residents, intellectuals, some of them being communists, some of them not, are going to support FDR. Minority communities, such as African Americans, Jewish Americans, and Catholics are going to come out in overwhelming numbers for FDR. And most importantly to this coalition of contradictions, the Southern Democrats, a segregationist wing of the Democratic Party that is going to be in direct opposition to African Americans throughout the entirety of the New Deal, but also onward. This coalition here will fracture in the 1960s over the question of civil rights. Right, African Americans in the 1960s, again, out of the scope of this, this lecture series, will demand civil rights. The Southern Democrats will abandon the party created by FDR here in the 1930s. Next slide. But regardless, FDR takes over in 1933, March 4th, as I read to you from his inaugural address, where he says that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so FDR sets out on a very robust campaign to reshape America in his first 100 days. What you have to remember is before Roosevelt, there was no benchmark of 100 days. He creates this by how prodigious he is in his execution. And so between March 9th and June 16th of 1933, FDR is going to pass 15 major bills and 77 individual laws in 100 days, which are focused on what he calls the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. He's also going to use executive power unlike any president before him. And by 1936, at his re-election campaign, he signs 1,300 executive orders to make sure that the New Deal and its agencies become law and to avoid that congressional deadlock. His first action is going to be a bank holiday where he closes the banks for a week to try to curb the run on banks and the failures of banks. And he's going to communicate these changes through something that becomes kind of emblematic of his presidency, and that is fireside chats. So almost immediately after taking over the presidency, he sits down to tell Americans why he's doing a bank holiday. Through 1933 to 1944, FDR is going to give 29 fireside chats where he speaks directly to the American public about issues facing the American public. Some of that still remains in the presidential addresses that are given today, where the president talks directly to all the citizens. But more importantly, he's going to redefine government action not as an individual choice, but as coming from the federal government. That the bulwark defense against the Great Depression will come from Washington, D.C. It will no longer be states and local communities. It will be from the top down. And he establishes, as I said, that 100-day benchmark. Next slide. And so this beautiful cartoon is going to kind of poke fun at FDR and what people at the time and now call the alphabet agencies. That FDR is playing a game of Scrabble and where he's inventing all of these new agencies. Most of them 3-letter acronyms, some of them that we'll talk about today, the CCC, the AAA, things like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, things of that nature. But these New Deal agencies, more than the laws individually, are going to be the foundation for the New Deal and its kind of infrastructure. Throughout his entire presidency, he is going to create 69 new agencies of the federal government. Insane, right? New secretaries, new positions, new administrations, as we'll see. Next slide. The first, chronologically, that was created by FDR was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. And its purpose was to provide young men with employment and to conserve America's natural resources. And they did this through hiring men aged 18 to 25. Eventually, Eleanor Roosevelt in the mid-1930s will create a wing of this that is specifically for women, to employ women as well. And it provided them with purpose, dignity, and wages so that they were able to kind of beat the unemployment that was on the rise. Their monthly income was about $30, which would today be $730, plus the federal government provided you with a family allotment that you could send back to your family of $25 or $610 today. In addition, they housed you, they fed you, they clothed you, and they provided medical care. And in its life duration, between 1933 and 1942, it employed 3 million Americans. And so some of the projects that the CCC was focused on was specifically those issues of conservation in the natural environment. They planted trees. In fact, they planted 3.5 million trees, so much so that the CCC was called Roosevelt's Tree Army. If you take all the hours combined of men employed by the CCC who fought fires, it totals 6.5 million days of fighting forest fires paid for by the federal government. And they expanded the public park system. There were 711 new state parks created in all 48 states. In Ohio, many of these still exist. Hocking Hills is a CCC project. Pike Lake and Shawnee State Park are all CCC projects. It's arguably, historians and economists alike have argued that the CCC is Roosevelt's most successful agency, that it paid people good jobs, it provided them with employment stability, and without it, many of the natural resources that now we enjoy today would not be available to the American public. Next slide. So here's a photo. Cuyahoga National Park, which is in Cleveland, Ohio, is a product of the CCC. You can see here in 1933, members of the CCC creating the roadways that would eventually become the entrance to the Cuyahoga National Park. Next slide. Did you enjoy it? Awesome. See, it's still reaping benefits all these years later. The next administration or action that FDR took just weeks after creating the CCC was the AAA, again, alphabet soup, three-letter acronyms. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is focusing on that long-standing issue of the agricultural economy. There's a reason that when I started this lecture series, we started with farmers. All right? They're the first people hit by the Great Depression, and in fact, they've been in such an economic slump that it's lasted since 1920. And so when FDR takes over, one of his first priorities is to remedy that agricultural rural economy. And the purpose of the AAA was to boost commodity prices through reducing the surplus on agrarian goods that were collected in the United States. How they were going to do this is that they were going to buy livestock that was raised by American farmers, slaughter it, and feed it to the hungry. They were also going to subsidize farmers either not to plant acreage or to curb their output so that there was less corn, less wheat, less rice, less tobacco being produced, right? Less supply, more demand, prices go up. The funding for this, where's the federal government going to get the money? Well, we're going to punish the farm processing companies, those in Chicago, those who handle the grain. They're going to get levied a new tax that's going to pay farmers directly to kind of alleviate those problems in the rural economy. The commodities that they're going to target, many of them will sound familiar. They're very regional: wheat, cotton, tobacco, dairy, hogs, rice. Many of these still have subsidies today. It's a lasting legacy of the AAA. And almost immediately, it raises commodity prices for farmers. And so it's very successful, and it endears farmers to FDR, mostly in the Great Plains or the upper Midwest throughout most of his presidency. Next slide, please. Unfortunately for FDR, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the Supreme Court is going to be a thorn in his side, and in 1936, they're going to rule that the AAA is unconstitutional. The court argues, and it deems that the regulation of the farm economy is a state power, not a federal. And they tell FDR that if he wants to continue the AAA, that they must revise it in Congress. Congress answers the call. 1938, they readjust some of the arguments that the Supreme Court laid out, and the AAA goes back into effect in 1938. The AAA, unlike the CCC, is not without controversy. The biggest being that many Americans were hesitant that the federal government was going to curb the food supply in a time of hunger. And so this is a thorn in the side for the New Deal Congress. And additionally, historians and economists alike have reviewed the AAA and have found that only those who benefited were landowning farmers in the Midwest, in the South, in the Great Plains, and that African-American sharecroppers in the rural South and tenant farmers all across the country were excluded from the AAA payments. Therefore, they were still hit by that agricultural depression, and many of them lost farms and suffered economically, even despite the AAA. Its legacy today, if we live in a rural farm economy, is that it lays the groundwork for federal government management of agriculture as a economic kind of foothold of America, and it laid the foundation to provide for today's crop insurance, for price supports, and for soil conservation, all of which still exist in the contemporary. And of course, FDR is hammering out this legislation. We could talk all day about all of the legislation he signed. There's a website, Living New Deal, that gives you a chronology of the New Deal. It's like a 10-page scroller. So we're just going to cover the big ones. But the next big one, right, is based off those lessons of the stock market crash of 1929, is FDR is arguing you have to do something about the banks. That the banks and Wall Street have operated with too much impunity, and therefore they should be reeled back. And so in 1933, the New Deal Congress passes the Banking Act of 1933. It sought to stabilize the banking system and limit bank runs and failures that had plagued the country. Its implementation is quite multifaceted, but we'll try to summarize it pretty concisely here. The first was that it's going to separate commercial banks from investment banks. No longer could banks do both. You can either accept deposits from customers or you can deal with stocks, bonds, and dealt in securities. You couldn't do both anymore. You couldn't risk people's life savings on bad bets. Think about Toledo hit by those bankers who were doing shady deals, millions of dollars lost out of the city of Toledo. This is going to curb that. They're going to create the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which would protect savings of Americans and restore confidence among the public. I mean, how many of us have heard stories about people after the bank runs would keep, hoard cash in their mattresses or in their floorboards? This legislation sought to end that, to restore confidence and build back up the banking system in the United States. It originally insured $5,000 worth of savings for an individual. Today, that is $125,000 of protections from the federal government. It's going to restrict speculations. It puts regulations on what bankers can spend people's deposited money on. And it's going to increase federal regulation of the banks and how they operate. It's largely successful. The FDIC still remains a functioning portion of the banking system in the United States even today. Next one. So all of this, why might, many of it could have been or was popular to the American people, upset some of those in power. And in his inaugural address, FDR seeks to antagonize and to call out the status quo, especially among business leaders in the banking and Wall Street men who kind of dominated the 1920s. He says, "The rulers of exchange of mankind's goods have failed. Through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence have admitted their failure and abdicated. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore the temple to the ancient truths, that the measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than monetary profit." And so when FDR is arguing this in 1932, it upsets many people. Many of them, this anger rides with them into 1933 and 1934, and that's where this gentleman comes into play, a gentleman named Smedley Butler, who in 1933 gets approached by business executives with the DuPont Corporation, the J.P. Morgan and Associates, Goodyear Tires, General Motors, and they give him a simple yet profound idea of what he should do next, and that is to launch a coup against FDR and install himself as the fascist dictator of the United States of America. Yes. This was their plan. Smedley Butler, a retired military general, as we'll find out, will take over power from FDR to stop the New Deal. They were arguing that FDR was leaning towards communism, that it was going to derive and bankrupt the country, and that he must be stopped immediately before his presidency could reach the end of one term, let alone two. God forbid they didn't know he was going to have four, right? So they want to stop this before it gets too far. So who is Smedley Butler, this gentleman here? He was recently, in 1933, retired Major General in the Marines. He was highly decorated, 34 years of service in the Marines, earning him 16 medals and 2 individual Medal of Honors for his service. At death, when he died, he was the most highly decorated man in military service in the United States. After this event, he writes this book, War is a Racket, in 1935, where he essentially says that American military pursuits during his time in the military were in the interest of the wealthy. Again, they didn't know he was going to write this book, so when the wealthy come and tell him to do a coup on FDR, they picked the wrong guy. And he describes his service as being a gangster of capitalism. And so what I'll show you next is that they approach Smedley Butler, these corporate elites in the United States, and the first thing he does is he immediately goes to Congress and becomes a whistleblower and tells them that these men have approached me and that there should be an investigation. So the video you'll see next is one that is taped from his deposition that was shown to Congress and where he kind of talks about this plan. So next slide.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institutions. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
And so Smedley Butler is a very well-spoken individual. His War is a Racket is a very enthralling book. It's very short, if you'd like to read it. But Smedley Butler, of course, as I said, they picked the wrong guy. And so when they come to him, they essentially outline a proposed coup that Congress hears in a closed-door session. And as he mentions, he was supposed to lead a group of 500,000 veterans. They were going to march on Washington, D.C. And then when they got to Washington, D.C., they would give Roosevelt two pretty easy options. The first was that we have an army in Washington, D.C., and that you can create a new position in the federal government called the Secretary of General Affairs, led by Smedley Butler as the dictator. And Roosevelt, you can be the sovereign head of state with no power and just, exist to create continuity between the new government. If that option doesn't sound great to you, FDR, you can just resign and give power to us now. Okay, those were the two options that they were proposing Smedley Butler offer up to Roosevelt. Of course, none of this ever happens, and in fact, FDR never publicly comments on the coup attempt, likely to try to not, spark fears among the American public. That being said, Congress does investigate, as I said, behind a closed-door session. No one is prosecuted, but the Congress does come out and officially declare that an investigation was done and that the plans were in place to do this takeover. At first, when this is revealed to the public, the newspapers think it's a joke. And in fact, the New York Times runs a piece saying that they believe that it was a hoax. But once the Congress confirms that it was real, they say, oh, no, sorry, I guess this was actually real. There was a potential fascist takeover. In fact, General Douglas MacArthur once called it the best laugh story of the year. But its legacy has largely been debated. There's a few books, one of them that I'll include in the recommendations at the end. But historians agree that there was a plan among the business elites, those DuPont executives, the J.P. Morgan, Goodyear Tire. It's unconfirmed if Henry Ford was in on it. But there was plans to remove Roosevelt and create a fascist dictatorship under Smedley Butler. But what we argue on, or we don't believe, is that this plan was ever going to work, that it was too grandiose in its origin, and that it was kind of impossible of ever succeeding. But it does serve to kind of remind us, as we'll talk about in a couple months, of the dissent that is going to grow against Roosevelt, both from his left and from his right to the New Deal. We'll talk about, sounded Canadian there for a second. We'll talk about Huey Long in Louisiana in a couple months. We'll talk about the German-American Bund and the American First Party. But this is just a little bit of a taste of what's to come. Next slide. Of course, this does not deter FDR from continuing his New Deal. As I said, he never publicly comments on this plan to oust him as President of the United States. And in fact, in the months after the proposed coup, he creates another organization, the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. Its idea was to employ Americans, build infrastructure, and support the arts, a kind of threefold administration. During its duration of lifetime, from 1935 to 1943, it employs 8 million Americans, and its projects that it undertakes are fourfold. The first being infrastructure. So the WPA, in its duration, lays down 620,000 miles of roadways. It builds 10,000 bridges, and that includes thousands and thousands of buildings. It was focused not just on infrastructure, but also the humanities as well. The Historical Record Survey sends historians and those trained in academia out to survey, preserve, and index local historical records. The Federal Writers Project sends out graduate students to conduct oral and written histories with minority groups in the United States, many of them being the formerly enslaved, those individuals that were held in bondage that were still alive in the 1930s. Actually, some of the best information we have on first person's accounts of bondage are from the Federal Writers Project. Things like the Delta Mississippi accent we have on film because of these projects. They also do the Federal Arts Projects, which pays artists to create public murals, sculptures, and posters throughout the United States. Its legacy is quite good as well. It improved not only the economic conditions for those 8 million Americans that it employed, which stimulated the economy, but it also greatly improved the quality of life for Americans suffering from the Great Depression. The swimming pools, the theaters, the public buildings that it created served as entertainment and recreation sites throughout the country. And in fact, the next couple slides, I do this with my students. I'll show you some WPA projects, and I'll ask if you can identify them. So next. All right, anybody, does this look familiar? Yes, hit it. You can click next. Yes, it's the main branch of the Toledo-Lucas County Library in Toledo. Created through the WPA. It was completed between 1939 and 1940. Many of the murals you can see here on the top rung. Next slide. All right, what about this one? Yes, at the Toledo Zoo. The Toledo Zoo Reptilia. WPA construction site finished in 1934. One of the earliest WPA projects completed in 1934, just a year after its creation. Next. Oh, that one didn't have the, you got to, yes, Otsego Park. Yes, part of the Wood County Park District. It was constructed between 1938 and 1939. There will be one more public breakfast on April 12th held at Otsego Park. Beautiful creation. Actually, the stones were supposed to be locally sourced from the Portage River, but they had to go elsewhere. But it was constructed, and in 1940, they opened the hall for rentals, and they charged $11, which is $240 today. And you can still rent Otsego Park if you call the park office. All right, next slide. All right, so that was a little bit of local trivia. As you can see, the WPA is wide-reaching not only in its construction all across the United States, but also in Northwest Ohio. As I kind of mentioned, there is a website if you would like to go. It's called the Living New Deal. It's a grassroots effort to catalog every single WPA project in the United States. It gives you the location, construction sites, and it gives you a map so you can look all across Northwest Ohio and in Ohio larger to see what is a WPA project. All right, in 1935, as we're rounding out this first administration, obviously FDR's first term lasts between 1933 and 1936. One of the last big efforts that he's going to undertake is the Social Security Act of 1935. Its purpose, like in New York, was to establish a social insurance program and welfare provisions across the United States. It provided worker retirement benefits to workers 65 age and older with an average one-time settlement or a payment. They didn't give you a monthly check of $58.06, which is around $1,300 today. It also provided unemployment compensation to workers. This was through a federal grant program that gave states the money to give it to the unemployed. And it gave aid to dependent children, those living with single mothers across the United States. This funding, which will sound familiar to anybody who has a job, was through workers pay into a system that gets put into a pool of money and paid to those 65 and over. It's a social insurance model. Its Depression-era impact was pretty immediate as well. It provided that stability to the economically disadvantaged, the elderly, the unemployed, the infirm, and the disabled. Its long-term legacy is that it still exists today, providing benefits to millions of Americans. The workers covered in the 1930s was about 55%. Today, retired workers covered by Social Security is 93%. It's one of the largest lasting legacies of the Great Depression felt by millions today. And so the next video I'll show you is as FDR is gearing up in 35 to run again in 36. He's going to target his Republican compatriots who are arguing, as you'll see, that all of these New Deal programs are awesome and great, but the Republicans can do them better. So, next slide.
We believe in Social Security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things, but we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better, and most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything.
That's my favorite video of FDR. I think it kind of summarizes that, he was a political navigator, that he used humor and he was a very good orator and he could speak directly to the American people. And so this is one of the challenges of the early New Deal, that first administration, is that he is convincing not only the American public, who is responding very resoundingly to his issues, but he's going to try to crush any opposition from the Republican Party. They're looking again to take over in 36. Many of you will know that it's not successful. He serves until he dies in 1944. And so really, he summarizes this first administration pretty succinctly. This is a campaign poster from 1936 that argues that FDR is the man with a heart and the Democratic Party is the party with a soul, and that if you continue the FDR administration, that the New Deal will continue. As we'll talk about later, he's going to toy with this idea of a second New Deal that does not come to fruition, that argues that Americans should have rights to homes, to good payment in perpetuity forever. But when he's gearing up in 36, he's going to argue that his first term accomplishments included increased financial stabilization and regulation, that the banks that had run amok with thousands of bank failures were being curbed. By 1934, bank failures had dropped from 4,000 to under 100. Right? This is a very tangible way of proving to the American public that the New Deal under FDR is working. That he's creating things like the FDIC, that he's banning banks from speculating with people's money, that he's restoring confidence in the American banking system. He's going to provide federal relief and work programs, that the New Deal has employed millions of the unemployed, that is set forth to recreate the United States through bridges, through roads, through parks, through soil conservation, all of these things which they will do more of. He increases the safety or social safety nets afforded to Americans, financial protections for the elderly, disabled, unemployed, and the infirm. He takes under economic reforms that are going to regulate the stock market, and the power centered is not going to be in Wall Street anymore, but it's going to be in Washington, D.C. That we no longer are beholden to the bankers, but instead are beholden to each other. And he's going to shift that political power and delivery. If you remember, as we talked about with the Republican ascendancy, that all of those administrations, the Harding, the Coolidge, the Hoover administrations, are going to argue that the only people that can pull us out of the Great Depression are by pulling yourselves up by your own means, through individual contributions. FDR is going to reverse that entirely and say, no, it's the federal government's job to ensure that people are not unemployed, that they have good paying jobs, that they have health care and things of that nature. And he's going to reverse all of those previous administrations, and he's going to center all of his power in the federal government, in the New Deal agencies. As we'll see as we go forward, this is going to become an issue in the domestic sphere. He's going to be challenged, as we'll talk about, from the left and the right, about, the left is going to argue that FDR is not doing enough, the right is going to argue that he's doing too much, and FDR is going to have to thread this needle of how much I can do and who is going to accept it. And so that's where we sit in 1935 heading into 1936, is that this is the first administration of FDR. I love that picture. If you didn't know, FDR was a habitual drinker and smoker, smoked multiple packs a day and drank martinis straight. In fact, he would be cut down in 1945 by a hemorrhage, most likely caused by high blood pressure. So he was only 63 when he died. He probably could have served 5, 6, 7 terms. I don't know, but and so next week we'll get more into the thematic chapters. Right now we've been kind of walking chronological through the Great Depression. And we'll start next month, with talking about strikes and labor unions. We'll move on in June to talk about New Deal ecology and the Dust Bowl and things of that nature. And so where we're at now is we're laying the groundwork for how FDR is going to respond to these individual issues. Next month, we'll talk about the Toledo Auto Light Strike of 1934, one of the most significant strikes in the country, and the kind of workers' revolt that happens in both town and country. All right, well, I have some time for questions. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight despite the rain, and we look forward to seeing you next month as well.